Welcome everyone to this evening's talk held by the Association of Engaged Buddhists. Tonight we have Bhante Pandit with this talk on lingering desire. There we go. I'm very pleased to introduce Bhante, and I will pass it over to you, Bhante. Thank you so much.
Okay, so this evening we are going to be talking about one of the technical lines. It's just one line in the Dhammacakka Sutta that I want to focus on. So this is a little bit of a technical discussion, maybe more technical than people would normally be accustomed to, but I like to do that, mix it up sometimes. I want to start with the story, however, of the page or the clerk who would become king. And the story goes that there was a king who took his armies and he invaded a kingdom and he won the battle. And he took his army into the city. And in the city, he said to his soldiers, right, go ahead and take whatever you want. It's all yours. Just take anything you want. So, of course, the soldiers all got excited and they went running off and, looting and stealing and taking everything that they could, all except for the page boy who stayed there next to the king. And the king said to him, go on, you can go too. You can take whatever you want to. And the page said, now, are you really sure? He said, yes, anything you lay your hands on, you can take, it's yours. So the page boy laid his hands on the king's crown and said, this is mine. So the king found this rather amusing, and he didn't give his crown to the page boy, but he was rather impressed by the chutzpah of the page. And so eventually he adopted the boy, and eventually the boy did become the king. So apart from the utter immorality of sending an army to go in, pillaging a city that you've taken over, the point of the story is that for most people, we miss the thing that is most important. Our focus is so easily and so quickly tied up with sense desires that this deludes us and means that we lose sight of that which is actually most important. And we get caught up in liking and disliking and wanting this and that, and forgetting about the ultimate, the thing that is actually truly transcendent. Of course, if you can get hold of the crown, then you own the entire kingdom, rather than just the things that you can pick up in the town. So in the same way, this is an enlightenment story suggesting to us that our focus gets caught up, we get too excited by the things of the senses, things that we can get, things that we can have, and so lose sight of that thing which is actually transcendent, which is actually the most important thing, which in Buddhism is enlightenment. But not just in Buddhism, other spiritual traditions, they all have this idea of something utterly transcendent, utterly other than the normal things that people can have. So this is our focus, the thing that we need to bear in mind. And this happens all the time, even for monks. I've just discovered something, a new, what the Buddha called cord of sense desire, or avenue of sense desire. Because as a monk in Thailand, I can't go shopping. I can't go into, 7-Eleven and buy all those nice things that you can buy. And ordinary things like a tube of Pringles, I can't just go and buy a tube of Pringles and sometimes I really want a tube of Pringles. In fact, sometimes the whole existence can get shrunk down to that one thing that you just really, really want. Anyway, I just discovered that on my phone, I can order from the shop and somebody brings it. So suddenly I have this avenue of sense desire, and I've been scrolling through my it's called Grab. Do you have Grab in Sydney? Okay, so Grab used to be just for cars, and then it was motorbikes, but now apparently you can go shopping in it as well. So this new avenue of sense desire has been absorbing my time. It gets quite clear, however, that there is a distinct difference in the nature of the mind when we are absorbed in stories. In my view, I like to call it stories, but in the Buddhist sense was sense desire. And there's a reason for this. Stories are things that make sense of chaos. The world around us is too big and too difficult and too complicated to understand. So we use stories, or you might say constructs in psychological language. George Kelly in personal construct theory, to make sense of the world. So in America right now, you have this strange situation with huge battles with the pro-abortion and the anti-abortion lobbies in America, and this Roe versus Wade decision, which it seems very odd to me, because the rest of the world has pretty much kind of decided on this issue. Some people may be more pro-life, some may be more pro-controls, but it's not such a big issue around everywhere else. But in America, it's become politicized. So now you are either an utter out and out religious person who will sanctify and cherish all life from the very first molecule, or you're a total and complete and utter free, what do they call, bodily autonomy person, and it becomes polarized. So that's an example of a construct that gets put up and then polarizes. Constructs, according to George Kelly, always had two poles. So as soon as you erect one pole of an idea or a story that organizes the world for you, it automatically brings into existence the opposite pole. This is the way we're used to, accustomed to looking at things. So this chord of sense desire means that we are continually, or the mind is continually sent outwards towards the things of the world, and you get caught up in it and obsess about it and think about it. And then when you come to do your meditation, you can't stop thinking about tubes of Pringles from the shop, and or seeking out the best prices for things. Or in my mind, I like inventing things. So I've been busy inventing a new kind of boat. I've never actually been on the water. I can't sail, and it'd be a disaster if I did, but it doesn't stop me dreaming and thinking about it. When you come to do your meditation, then these things start to pop up into the mind because you have trained your mind in that way. Meditation is not difficult. It's very simple, very straightforward, and very easy. But you make it difficult because you would rather sit there thinking about something than you would do your meditation. In meditation, you only have to stop. That's all you need to do. Stop and be awake. But you make it difficult. And I see this over and over again. One teacher said to me, I think I've told you this story. He said, you must never try in meditation. That's his idea. The Buddha himself said you continually make an effort, unremitting mindfulness. put forth effort like a man whose hair was on fire would try to put out that fire. That's the effort you should be making in your meditation. So I disagree with the teacher a little bit, but the point is that when the mind settles down and becomes self-aware, stops reaching out towards things of the senses, then it becomes brighter, clearer, sharper, happier, and starts to gain its own momentum. You need less and less effort because that experience of the mind is more and more beautiful. And as it becomes beautiful, so the mind will concentrate more easily. So the way that the Buddha described it briefly, this is what I've talked about in the last few times that I've talked to you. So I'll just go over it briefly. I'm going to try and share my screen now. If you can just give me a thumbs up, if you can see the screen with the world and the senses. Okay. So here on the screen.
Bhante, you can expand it, like you can expand it, isn't it?
It is on my screen, it's completely expanded.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Is it coming out small for you?
It's not the full screen. It's not the full screen. So I thought there would be a button that you can expand it.
I was seeing it full screen for some reason.
Oh, is it? You saw it full screen? Okay. Yep.
It's full screen on my screen.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. But now I shared the wrong one. Okay, let's go back. Should be this one. Okay. So you should be able to see on the right-hand side the world. This is the world with its myriad of experiences and events and stories and all the magical, mysterious stuff that the world can produce. In Buddhism, the world is reduced to the 6 senses. And I can describe it this way. Some years ago, many years ago, I was talking to my mother and I was explaining a little bit about meditation. And I said that chasing after the sense desires is not the goal of Buddhism. And I described it like this: if a person goes to, i.e. my parents, if they go to France, they like to eat all the French food, and then they go to Germany, they like to eat the German food. They come to Thailand, they get excited about the Thai food. And in my mind, it's just food. My mother said, well, that's brain dead. She didn't find this was, didn't associate with this teaching at all. So there are these 2 different ways of looking at things. There are the myriad of endless different experiences in the world, endless different kinds of food that you can eat. And it can be exciting, it can be your job, and you can be a chef, or you can just enjoy eating and experiencing different foods. But we can also boil that down to all of those experiences from the tongue. We just boil it down to taste sense. And in this way, we can boil down the entire world. Everything in the entire world comes down to one of these 6 senses. Now, of course, you have a feeling sense that you can feel in the body. Right now, you can feel your bum on the seat if you pay attention. You can feel your heart beating, maybe. You can feel hot or cold. There are always smells in your nose, even though you very rarely pay attention to it. There are always smells in your nose, tastes on your tongue. Even if the eye is closed, it is still seeing. There's still a difference between when you put your attention on your eye and when you put your attention onto the back of your head. There's a difference. The eye is still seeing, even if your eyelid is closed. The ear, there are always sounds that are going on. So these 5 senses of the body are pretty clear and obvious. By the way, in psychology, there are actually more than 5 senses. There is the vestibular sense, I think it's called, which tells you if you're spinning around. So if you turn your head very quickly, your sense knows that it's your head that's turned, not the world. And if you freeze this sense, which you can do, it's inside the inner ear. If you freeze this sense, then and ask the person to turn their head, what happens is it will look as if the world has suddenly moved and you'll fall over. You can see the same thing as if when you were a child, young and stupid, and you would spin around and around in the playground and then suddenly stand still and you would fall over or nearly fall over. That's because of this vestibular sense. So there are, in fact, several body senses. There's one that senses where your body is in relation to itself, so that if you close your eyes, you can still put your finger on your nose because you know where your finger is in relation to your nose. This particular sense, some people are born without, and there was a interesting case of a man, you find him on YouTube, and he doesn't have this sense. So if he's not looking at his feet, he has no sense of where his feet are. So the only way that he can walk is to look at his feet. And if he stands and looks around, because he doesn't know where his feet are, he has to hold on to something like a railing or a wall in order to be able to orientate himself. So these are different bodily senses, but for the sake of boiling things down, we can boil the entire world down to these 5 chords of sense desire. The 6th sense, the mind sense, is quite interesting because we can call things into mind. You can call into mind something or somebody that you've seen, into mind an old conversation. Interestingly, the mind sense always uses one of the other senses. It's very difficult to have any kind of purely mental sense. You can argue about it, things like, well, fear isn't one of the senses, but then there's always something that you are afraid of. Fear doesn't come completely naked. There's always something that sparks it. There's always a physical feeling associated with it. According to my school of psychology, Gestalt, things actually appear one by one, complete and whole in themselves. So if you think of something that makes you afraid, well, I don't know what makes people afraid. Big dogs. If you think of a big dog snarling at you, that's a visual image. It's also an audible image. It's also mental because the dog isn't in front of you. So the mind will make a gestalt, a thing basically, and then present that thing to consciousness. And that thing will include both the physical and the mental aspects. So a dog has a certain size, has a certain row of teeth, has a certain ferocity, a certain danger, has certain memories associated with it. All of this is then presented to the consciousness as the dog. So in Buddhism, the mind is also a sense, just as much as the other senses are. This is quite important because in Western philosophy or Western way of thinking, we tend to think of the senses as being outside and the mind as being inside. But in Buddhism, this is not the way that we are encouraged to look at things. We're encouraged to look at things as a moment of consciousness fading away with another moment of consciousness, or I should say cognition, cognizing something. Then that thing disappears and you cognize something else. So right now, you can cognize the feeling of the seat on your bum on the seat. Can you do that? Your attention turns to it and you can feel it. Or you can turn your attention to the sound of the, by the looks of you, probably a heater. Where I am, it's an air conditioner. That sound was there the whole time, but you weren't hearing it the whole time. Only one thing at a time comes into cognition. While you're cognizing the heater through the air sense, you're not remembering something that somebody said to you this morning that you liked or you didn't like. If you're remembering what they liked, what they said to you this morning, then you're not focusing on the taste in your mouth, and so on and so forth. So the actual experience, when we turn mindfulness to it, is of one thing cognized, comes into cognition, into consciousness, starts to break up quite quickly, disappears, and another thing will come into consciousness. And that thing will start to break up, and another thing will come into consciousness. Each of those things, each of those moments of cognition is a gestalt, which means it includes physical and mental aspects. And it presents itself as a figure on the ground or foreground on a background. So right now you can see the computer as a single thing, right? Your computer is a single thing, and it appears on your desk. So your desk is the background, the computer is the foreground. But then you can look at the space bar on your computer, and suddenly the space bar is now your foreground or your object of cognition, and the computer is the background to it. You can look at the lead that's plugged into your computer, or look at the camera on your computer. You can take objects out of your experience and put them into the foreground. That's cognizing something. And this process of cognizing things is the mind jumping from one thing to another thing, to another thing, to another thing. This, the Buddha said, is the nature of consciousness, not monkey consciousness, as in you can't concentrate on anything or your mind is scattered, but all consciousness, all worldly consciousness or sense-based consciousness is doing this all the time. No matter how concentrated or how serene you are, this process is still happening. So the mind passing from one thing to another thing to another thing, with these moments of cognition continually hoving into conscious field and then disappearing and something else coming into conscious field. When you look at this directly with mindfulness, it becomes quite uncomfortable. You get this desire for wanting to somehow separate yourself from this process. It becomes a burden to be feeling like this. And suddenly you start to say, well, my mind is not concentrated, or my mind is scattered, or I can't control your mind. Missing the fact that this was actually your mind the whole time. It's not just now when you got into meditation. This is the nature of your mind the entire time. So as different things pile into consciousness, we can separate them into these 6 broad definitions of something we can see, hear, taste, smell, touch, feel, or use the mind to create a perception of. There is no internal or external. All these are the mind going outside of itself, if you like, its original nature, and getting caught up in cognizing things. So we should be able to see on the screen the entire world can get summarized into these 6 senses. And I may, if any of you have read the fairy tale of the golden ass, which was a ancient Roman, now it may be Greek, but I'm thinking it's an old Roman tale. And in it, the heroine is captured by a man who takes her away to be his wife. And she is given the task of 5 different kinds of beans or peas, all mixed together and thrown on the floor. And she has to separate these 5 kinds of beans into 5 different piles. And so she finds this a difficult and onerous task. The symbolism of this story, which you may remember from one of the versions of Cinderella, she also had 2 kinds of lentils that she had to separate. The 2 kinds of lentils represent wholesome and unwholesome. So you have wholesome cognition and you have unwholesome cognition. It's one way to think of it. Or in the Roman fairy tale, then there are 5 different kinds of beans that you have to separate. what this means is the entire world can be summarized into these 5 compartments. It's just seeing, just smelling, just tasting, just touching. Now, one of the problems with mindfulness, the way that it's taught these days, is that people are taught to focus in on that sense. So I remember being taught mindful eating. So when you put the food into your mouth, you very consciously are aware of the saliva, you're aware of the teeth, you're aware of the tongue, you're aware of the flavors. And I really didn't like this meditation. Maybe like bite my tongue. Did you ever do that? If you're doing it something consciously, suddenly it becomes very difficult. I remember working as a welder in New Zealand when I was 20 years old, and we were walking along an unstable rail about 60, 70 feet up in the air in a giant warehouse. And first of all, when you try and walk along this rail, which would be easy if it was on the ground, but being 60 foot up in the air, it was extremely difficult because suddenly you're trying to do it consciously. The conscious mind isn't very good at doing things. The unconscious mind is much better at doing things. And so I lost my track now. So this is a way that we can summarize the way that the world is being perceived with the mind reaching out to each one of these senses. Now, I put up on the screen here a little meditator on the left-hand side, because our job as a meditator is not to get caught up in the senses. So when mindfulness teachers often teach, be aware of the chewing, be aware of the tongue, or be aware of the feet placing on the ground. Yes, it's quite serene. It's a step. It's a useful and handy step. But to an experienced meditator, this isn't the task of meditation. Our task of meditation is to separate entirely from whatever form of cognition is coming up into the mind. So I put up on the screen here a happy little meditator in the Maitreya Buddha pose with one leg folded under him and one leg on the floor. I don't know, it's one of my favorite ways to sit. And it's actually, if you look at Maitreya Buddha, he's always presented as sat on a seat with one leg folded under him and the other leg on the ground. So the way that the Buddha taught this is how monks is one who guards the doors of the sense faculties. Having seen a form with the eye, the bhikkhu does not grasp at its signs and features. If he grasps at the signs and features of that moment of cognition, evil, unwholesome states of desire and displeasure might invade him. So he practices the way of restraint. He guards the eye faculty. He restrains the eye faculty. So while mindfulness in the initial stages will be being mindful of something, like being mindful of walking, being mindful of eating, being mindful of hearing. As you get more advanced in meditation, it's mindfulness is knowing yourself even when you are eating, or even when you are walking, even when you are touching. You're not allowing the mind to get caught up in that thing that you are cognizing. Every moment of cognition can be summarized into one of those 6 things. We don't allow the mind to go out and get caught up in the things that we can cognize, see, hear, taste, smell, touch. What happens then is the mind starts to dissociate or separate from the content of the mind. If you like, you can call it the mind knowing the mind. You can call it the mind without an object. This is one of the terms the Buddha used, citta anaramana. Citta is the mind, aramana is the object in the mind. Citta anaramana is the mind without an object. Now, this is one of the descriptions the Buddha gave for enlightenment, or the experience of enlightenment, even if one is not an arahant. So don't think that this is what you should be doing immediately. Sometimes it takes months or years or weeks. Even for myself, sometimes I can sit here for days on end and just the mind refuses to respond. And it goes like that sometimes. But other times the mind comes together and becomes self-knowing, becomes silent, becomes very happy, becomes very bright. There is a feeling of a gathering of power and a gathering of energies, a gathering of life force. This is the experience that we should be aiming towards in meditation. And you do it by holding the mind in this kind of limbo or non-engaged state where the mind doesn't become dissipated by focusing on objects of cognition. Now, this is a topic that I've been talking about recently in the last few times that I've been with you guys. So I wanted to show how this relates to the original teaching on suffering of the Buddha. This is the Dhammacakka Sutta, where the Buddha outlined the Four Noble Truths. And I've always been bemused by this sutta because just about every teacher worth their salt that I've ever met has written a book on the Four Noble Truths. Tibetan Buddhists have, forest monks have, scholars have, Mahasi Sayadaw has. And usually it's a whole book on the Four Noble Truths. But what's interesting to me is originally, in the original sutta, there's not very much to it. It's actually very short, sharp, succinct, and I think fairly clear, except for one little phrase, which I want to talk about today. So I've put the oh, now it's anyway, I hope you can all see and read that, but if not, I'm going to read it out to you. We're not going to go through the entire sutta, that would take much too long. Just going to focus on a couple of parts of this. So in this key sutta, which outlines the Four Noble Truths, supposed to be the cornerstone or key teaching in Buddhism, monks, there are these two extremes which should not be followed by one who is homeless, and by homeless in the suttas was meant becoming a monk. One, the pursuit of sensual happiness. This is low, vulgar, the way of worldly people, ignoble and unbeneficial, the way of sensual happiness. And two, the other thing that should not be pursued is the pursuit of self-mortification, which is painful, ignoble, and unbeneficial. Without veering towards either of these extremes, the Tathagata, which means the Buddha, has awakened to the middle way. So the original middle way in Buddhism related to becoming a monk and living in the forest. You are not one of the worldly people. You're not in the world with jobs and families and etc., but also you're not one of these harsh ascetics who at the time of the Buddha used to do all kinds of weird practices like living as if they were a dog, walking around on all fours, or going without clothes, starving themselves, etc. And this was originally the middle way. There is another definition of the middle way, by the way, which means not making too much effort and not making too little effort. So that was another definition at another point. But here it relates to the monastic life. This gives rise to vision, seeing. Now, this word seeing is interesting, that it doesn't mean seeing with the understanding. That's the word panya, wisdom. This is seeing, dasana. It means to see. You actually see it firsthand. The Buddha described the experience of enlightenment as jnana dasana, knowing and seeing. And again, dasana, seeing, not understanding, not wisdom, but seeing directly. gives rise to knowledge or knowing directly. Again, not knowledge as in book knowledge, but you see and know directly. It leads to peace, direct knowledge, and to nibbana. There are various different translations of these terms, which we can get caught up in, but I want to press on. So what is the middle way of practice? It's right view, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. I'm sure you're familiar with the Eightfold Path. Interesting that none of these terms are actually defined here. So one assumes that this sutta was not what the Buddha actually spoke to the 5 ascetics when he traditionally gave this sutta, but is a summary that was put together during the lifetime of the Buddha to summarize or key into his teaching. At that time, they would all know what right view means, what right thought means, what right speech means. It's something that would have been recited and discussed between the monks at the time. So very often we find in these suttas, it's like bullet points or cliff notes, they call them in America. I don't know if you have cliff notes in Australia. We don't have them in England. It's when you are studying for an exam and instead of reading the book for English literature, you just buy this little book of notes, which tells you the important points. And you just read that instead of reading the original text. So that's very much what suttas were. They would give bullet points. And the tradition was that you would recite the sutta, then you go back and discuss the different points amongst you. So there's no definition here given for what this Noble Eightfold Path is. There are just these 8 statements. So moving on from that, the Buddha goes on, having defined the middle way, he goes on to describe the 4 Noble Truths themselves. And again, they're actually very short and sharp. Fascinating how many people have written long and lengthy and sometimes very complicated, sometimes very nice books about the 4 Noble Truths, but actually it's remarkably simple. It's just a very simple, straightforward phrase. The Noble Truth of suffering. Rebirth is suffering, old age is suffering, illness, death, association with the things that you dislike, separation from the things that you like, and not getting what you wish for is all suffering. So in brief, the 5 grasping aggregates are suffering. I don't want to go into now what the grasping aggregates are, but they're the khandhas, if you know that teaching. So it's a very simple definition of suffering, old age, rebirth, illness, death, not getting what you like, being separated from what you like, and getting connected with the things that you dislike. That's suffering. A very simple, straightforward definition, and that's it. So the origin of suffering, or we should call it the arising of suffering, is interesting. This is the craving that leads to future rebirth, mixed up with relishing and greed. Relishing means to delight in. So things that you delight in and you wish for, that you like, greed. Taking pleasure in various realms. That is craving for sense pleasures, craving for becoming, and craving for cessation. I'm going to go through these terms and say what these 3 things are. But just for context, we'll finish the section of the sutta. The Noble Truth of cessation of suffering, it's the fading away and cessation of these 3 things, the craving for sense pleasures, becoming, and cessation. The craving for these, and here's the title of the talk. It doesn't say it in this translation, but I have a translation by Mahasi Sayadaw, which I really like. He says, slightly different translation, the origin of suffering rightly understood. It is the craving that leads to birth. It consists of lure and lust, and it lingers now here, now there. And this was the phrase that always interested me, like, what is it, how is desire lingering here and there in the context of these three things: sense pleasures, becoming, and cessation? So we're going to go into what that is. And the fading away of that lingering desire. And like that, this was the point that always interested me, and that to my mind wasn't very clear. This is the sutta in entirety, so it's our job to try and make head or tail of it the best that we can. Just for completion, the last part he said on suffering, the noble truth that leads to the cessation of suffering is the Eightfold Path: right view, right thought, right speech, etc. So the three parts that I have highlighted here: the origin of suffering, the craving for sense pleasures, the craving for becoming, and the craving for, I've written cessation, but it should be non-becoming. The Pali words, sense pleasures, is gama, gama tanha. Tanha is craving or thirsting for. Bhava tanha, and bhava I've translated in previous talks with you. I always translate bhava as conscious engagement with an object, but here it has a slightly different meaning. And the third one, vipava. Okay, so here are the three kinds of mind states that you can have according to Buddhism. So the three kinds of it's called becoming, or three kinds of bhava in another teaching, because these three different mind states lead to rebirth in three completely different kinds of realms. So first one is kama bhava. This means when the mind is consciously engaged with an object of the sense that you either like or you dislike. This is the kama bhava, or the sense desire realm. So putting your mind on nice things, or putting your mind on unwholesome things, will lead to rebirth in heavens and hells, according to Buddhism. And if you are very holy and very beautiful in your conduct and very virtuous, you can rise up to a very refined state of mind, which will get you reborn in one of the sense desire heavenly realms. In terms of what you experience here on earth, it means that you get you can make yourself very refined or very purified state of mind. But it's still just having one object of sense after another object of sense, one moment of cognition after another moment of cognition. It just means that you're cognizing nice things. You're not fostering greed, hatred, and delusion. So if you start focusing on, on politics or global warming or different things, you can arouse unwholesome states of mind. If you start focusing on your pet cat, as Joyce has her pet cat with her right now. For me, I have 3 kittens in the corridor down here. And they're just starting to play. And so I go down there about 3 times a day with different things that I can use as a toy. So if I focus on the kittens, my mind becomes very beautiful. However, there's a second kind of level of purity of the mind, and that is when the mind enters into jhana. And jhana is total concentration on an object. Usually the object that we use for concentration is the breath, but it can be other things like light, can be loving kindness even. It's possible to attain to high concentration. And what this means is this one moment of cognition with the next moment of cognition and the next moment of cognition that is normally experienced. When we practice high concentration, we have a moment of cognition and freeze. So that thing doesn't vary, doesn't change, doesn't dissipate. So you're just on the breath and only the breath. Now the breath moves in and out, but after a while you get what's called the nimitta, or the sometimes called the counterpart sign, which means a single gestalt cognition of breathing. And that's one thing. The mind coalesces around it and doesn't move. When the mind gets highly concentrated on something, it becomes very blissful, becomes very pleasant. However, what you have done is still just have another moment of cognition. Remember the senses, the mind cognizing one thing after another thing after another thing. Even in this high refined state, what happens is the mind is just cognizing something. We've just slowed down the process and frozen the mind on it. So the mind becomes stuck with light or breathing or loving kindness or earth element or body awareness. It's just another moment of cognition, of cognizing something, but we've frozen our mind onto it. This is what's called jhana. But jhana is just another kind of cognizing something, right? You will stay in the state of concentration for as long as you determined to stay in it. However, your mind will fall out of that state of concentration. Therefore, no matter how blissful or no matter how happy the mind is, it's still just another moment of cognizing something. It's just been very refined and slowed down and still. So this is the second level of the mind. And according to Buddhism, if you have practiced this concentration at any time in your life, when you die, you will be reborn in what's called the form realms. And these are the next higher up realms than the heavenly realms of sense desire, because the sense desire realms still rely on this endless cognizing process. So it's a less refined state of existence. Now, I haven't been to these realms myself, so I'm telling you what the book says. The next thing, that if you practice concentration very strongly, you can actually give up the object of concentration and you switch to infinite consciousness, infinite space, nothingness, or neither perception nor non-perception. So what you're doing here is the object of concentration is something without form. Infinite space has no form. If I ask you to concentrate on the breathing, it has a certain form. Or even something like democracy has a word and an image, some kind of form associated with it. But infinite consciousness, it has nothing. What if you concentrate your mind on infinite consciousness, then all experiencing ceases except for that very ephemeral state. Now you can do this deliberately by setting your intention to develop that concentration. And this is vibhava. Bhava is translated as becoming, but bhava really means an action or taking an action. In fact, our word for meditation in Buddhism is bhavana, which means to make, become, or to do, or an action. Bhava is always has this idea of acting or doing something. So even if you fix your mind onto this really ephemeral state of supreme consciousness, it's still an action that your mind is taking. It's still just another kind of cognizing that you have. Now, there may be no suffering in that state of mind, but the suffering is lingering. And the reason why it's lingering is because the mind is generated by a force of desire. And when that force of desire is expended, you're going to fall out of that consciousness and back into regular consciousness again. So this is what the Buddha was pointing to in this sutta, that even if you practice very high, very deep, very beautiful, very blissful states of mind through concentration, the suffering lingers. You might not be suffering while you're doing that meditation, but the suffering lingers because it's powered by desire. It's powered by the force of will, by concentration. and it's still just the mind cognizing another object. So this is what I think, at least. I should say that many other people will have many different interpretations, because in the sutta it's never explained what is meant by this desire that lingers now here and there. I mean, it sounds like Freudian, doesn't it? It sounds like you have some kind of trauma in your past that's lingering around there in your subconscious that you have to go and dig out. The Buddha never had teachings like that. You have to dig out things from your subconscious. He's referring to here the three different kinds of mind that you can have. Mind that is focused on something in the sense desires, which means some form of cognizing object after object after object, or some kind of meditation where you freeze the mind onto an object, or some kind of vipassana or non-becoming, non-action meditation, but that's still powered by the force of desire, craving. So come back just to finish off. The way that the Buddha was teaching was not to do a meditation whereby you focus on any object of the sense, but on this process of disengaging or restraining the mind from going out to anything. This was exiting from the entire system, the system of the karma bhava, acting within the sense desire realm, the bhava, and the vipassana, which is the refined states of meditation, exiting from this entire process of cognizing objects altogether. This was what the Buddha was pointing to, and this is what, in fact, all enlightenment traditions are pointing to. So most enlightenment traditions actually have like an accusation that they have against all other traditions, even within their own religion. So the Sufis have it, but regular Muslims blame the Sufis. Christianity has it, but regular Christians blame these mystic Christians. And Buddhism has it too, is the accusation of quietism. So some people say that by meditating, what you are doing is simply quieting the mind. And by quieting the mind, you're not experiencing pleasant and unpleasant states. So yes, it becomes a little bit peaceful, but all you've done is just flatten out the mind. You've resigned from life, and this isn't enlightenment. So most, wherever you find the teaching of enlightenment, you will find a bunch of people who have this accusation of quietism. Well, you're just blanking out the mind. And they're right. If you just get some kind of cognition, focus the mind onto it and freeze the mind there, you're just engaging in quietism. Here the Buddha is pointing to something completely different, exiting from this entire system altogether. What happens, as I keep wanting to stress, is there's a feeling of gathering of energy. There's a feeling of brightness, sharpness, alertness. There's a feeling of knowing your own self. There's a insight that the Buddha calls knowing what is the path and what is not the path. Again, he doesn't explain it, but you can find it within your own experience. You can feel the mind as the mind goes out to something to cognize. You feel it when the mind returns. So this is the state of enlightenment, or in terms of practice, is very sharp, or what the Buddha called unremitting, unrelenting mindfulness. That is the mind knowing itself in present time, without moving even a tiny bit. So this is the state of mind that he is talking about. So I'm going to stop there. I will put back on the actual statement. So the craving that leads to future rebirth mixed up with lust and desire, lingering now here, now there. That is craving for sense desire, craving for becoming, and craving for cessation. That was the actual word of the second noble truth. So if anybody has any questions or comments, it's a little bit of a technical discussion. We should have technical discussions every now and then. There are other days where we have fun stories or generalized discussions, and we talk about more human things like how to deal with children and things like that. But today I thought we'd do this technical discussion.
So if anyone has any questions or comments, just unmute, and or if you wish to, you can also put a comment in the chat and I can read that out for you if you prefer that. But I will mute and off you go. Thank you, Bhante.
Bhante, could you talk a little more about the mind when it's not frozen onto an object? Apart from being brighter, clearer, and I don't know what else. Just so that we might recognize it if it happens to us.
This is what you've just asked is really been the entirety of my 25 years as a monk, because nobody ever told me that there is an experience that happens when the mind isn't cognizing objects, when the mind returns to itself. This is an experience. And there was my own teacher would teach this, and he'd teach it the mind. The key experience is the mind coalesces in light, as a point of light. And there was a couple of women that came to my temple from America, and they'd been practicing with a very well-known teacher over there in America. And I shouldn't say his name, but she had gone to this teacher and said, my mind has coalesced into this point of light. It's very blissful, it's very happy, and it's drawing me in. And the teacher said, this is wrong. You've got caught up in delusion. Exit from that experience immediately and go back to counting the breaths, 1 breath, 2 breath, 3. And she thought that's not right. Her intuition had told her that that's not what's happening. Now, intuitions can be wrong. I've met many people with many intuitions. In fact, I can tell you a funny story if you want about that, about a crazy French guy who had an intuition about me that was clearly wrong because it was about me, so I know it was wrong. So she came to my temple, her and a friend. She actually experienced this by herself, left the retreat and taught it to a friend of hers who also attained to the same experience. So she came to my temple, and the abbot, he was very much, he could look into your mind directly. So he called them over and said, this is what you're experiencing and this is what you should do with it. And she said, yes, that's exactly what I'm experiencing. So he taught her one-to-one. So that's the point, is that actually is an experience of vibrancy, of gathering together. There's the experience of generalized body awareness. And I say generalized because body awareness can often mean like a painful knee or an aching back or something. But this is a generalized awareness of the entire body, and it will appear as either neutral or pleasant. If it appears as pleasant, go into that. There is nothing wrong with that pleasant feeling, because the mind isn't getting drawn out into anything. If your mind does get drawn into the body, you start to see that. You start to see the mind coalescing around something. But when the mind doesn't get drawn into anything, there is experience there, and it's brighter, sharper, clearer. Some of the indicators that you're on the right path, that many people experience, in fact, you may experience the body being extremely large. And sometimes this happens with just your hands or just your neck or your face will appear very large. Or sometimes it feels like your entire body is extremely large. if that happens, you go into that large body and carry on meditating from there. This is actually one of the indicators that you're on the right way. Another experience is one of light. So the Buddha, as we saw in this sutta, the Dhammacakka Sutta, the chakra can be a wheel, but it can also mean the eye. And we saw in the sutta, he said, vision arises, seeing arises. Aloko Uddapadi in the next thing, Aloko is sphere of light arises. So the Buddha's using these very clear words to say there's a strong, clear awareness that comes up. There is a sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya where Anuruddha, the Buddha's cousin, comes to the Buddha and he says, sometimes I experience the bodies. And he said it's like a reed where you pull the reed out of a skin of the reed and you get another reed. And you can pull the skin out of that and get another reed. He said in the same way, you pull a body out of the body, out of the body. Rarely gets talked about by teachers, but this is right there in the suttas, that one body gets drawn out of the coarse body, a more refined body. So he says, Anuruddha says to the Buddha, sometimes I see bodies and sometimes I see light, which is correct. And the Buddha didn't say both of these are wrong or you're getting deluded. He says, you're getting on the right track. Now, what you need to do is get rid of the hindrances. So no sense desire, no doubt, no agitation in the mind. Concentrate the mind and bring these experiences together. So these are some of the things that indicators along the way. In my own tradition, they teach this to very high level. My own meditation isn't up to such high level, but then they go into all kinds of experiencing different realms and ghosts and devas and all kinds of weird stuff starts happening. But the general teaching is not to get caught up in the manifestations of the mind, but very definitely there is this awakening experience, somebody awakening is very clear, it's very visual, it's very present. So if this starts happening to you, then understand that this is the right way that your mind is attaining to. Don't try and go back to your previous meditation object. There's a point where you transcend your meditation object.
Thank you, Bhante. Thank you.
The question is how. So the way how is this teaching that the Buddha continually gave, a sutta after sutta after sutta, about the mind going out to a sense object, and you restrain the mind. So you're sitting there in meditation and you think about, have I fed the cat? Your mind has gone out to the cat. You start to get caught up in the story and the thinking about it. Don't get caught up in that image of the cat. Bring the mind back. Then the mind goes out to a sound, you bring the mind back. Your mind goes out to a feeling in the body, you bring the mind back. And continually, by not allowing the mind to get caught up and engaged in the manifestations of the mind, bit by bit, the light starts to turn on. The presence starts to make itself known. And you know when you're present and when your mind is becoming unpresent. For example, you sit there meditating, and I was thinking about inventing my boat, and this idea popped into my head while I was meditating, and then I realized that I'd been gone for 20 minutes. Well, to know when you're gone and when you're not gone, that's the key for me. That's the key to meditation. I know when I'm lost or caught up in something and when I'm not, including like chewing food. which can be a nice meditation, but you're still getting caught up in another object of sense. Your consciousness is coalesced around it. So it's continually bringing the mind back and holding it in this kind of limbo of non-engagement, or in the words of the sutta, which you should be able to see on your screen, the Buddha said, there's a different one, remember. Okay, you should be able to see that. He practices the way of restraint. He guards the eye faculty. He restrains the eye faculty. You're not creating another thing to cognize. You're restraining the mind from this process of cognizing one thing after another thing, after another thing, after another thing. That's why enlightenment is completely separate or other than all other worldly paths, because every other path you can do is just some kind of cognizing things. You can develop, postures and qigong and all kinds of different things, but they're developing certain perceptions. In this, you want to turn the mind back on itself, so the mind knows the mind directly. It's something that emerges as well. You hold your mind in the limbo, and then this emerges bit by bit. But as it emerges, do recognize it.
Bhante, sometimes, the word restrain sounds a bit like you put in a lot of energy to refrain you from, say, you're thinking about your boat and things like that. I understand the feeling is that sometimes you think of, when I'm planning something and then it's, one after I have to do this for that, like you just go away and okay, I got to come back. It's like the more you try to stop it, it's like you put more energy to it, like it's more vibration to it, and it's kind of expand, isn't it? So I'm just like, sometimes I just like sometimes you just gone unconsciously for some time and okay, you come back. And I'm just trying to bring my awareness to be aware that I'm away.
Yeah.
To come back, not to like, if I try to beat myself, stop it. It's like, I think it doesn't work.
Right, but that's the point. That act of stopping is an action that you are making. So the state that, as the enlightenment state start to manifest, this is not an action that you are making. It's not doing, it's a non-doing or non-action. So when you're trying really hard and you're trying to stop it, that's just another action that you're taking. So that then becomes the thing that's hindering you. That's why the Buddha used this word restrain. There was the sutta of the bear tied to a post, chained to a post, and the bear will try to get into the forest, will try to move away, but if it's chained to the post, after a while, and the post is strong, after a while, that bear will lie down. So that's what we do with the mind, is we continually restrain it. The post, by the way, is mindfulness of body. Mindfulness of body is key to this process, because light and the body is what will manifest when the mind stops cognizing things. And it's a little confusing because people think, well, isn't that just cognizing the body? But I can only say that in terms of experience, when the mind is coalescing around a particular thing and when it isn't. When it isn't, there will be body consciousness and light and a gathering of energy present there. So, I like this word restrain, because the bear, you're just restraining the bear. You're not trying to fight the bear. You're not trying to kill the bear. You're not trying to tame it and jump on it and ride it. You just restrain it. And then the proper consciousness will start to emerge by itself. From my experience, it takes an enormous effort to get the process going. But you need less and less effort, especially as you start to enter the blissful states, because it's pleasant and you feel it like, oh, this is nicer, this is purer, this is, and the mind will naturally want to go that way. Yeah. But it does take an enormous effort. You know, my problem, you might think as a monk that it might be easier because especially the last few years, I've been sat here with nothing to do. For 3 years, I haven't done anything. I didn't write any of the books. I didn't make any of my videos, nothing. So I can meditate for 6 hours a day, but I have no urgency. And when I was working in the university, or was going out teaching or running my group and things like that, when I would sit, I'd only have like 30 minutes or an hour, and I would make a clear, determined effort. But now that I don't have anything to do, I don't make the effort. I'm like, well, I can think about my boat for 10 minutes and then I'll start. So to arouse the effort is, you know, is quite difficult. The Buddha continually talked about unremitting mindfulness, arousing effort, putting in energy. He continually used these words. Go to the roots of cliffs, the roots of trees, meditate like your hair was on fire. These are the kind of words the Buddha would use. The Chinese, when they got Buddhism, they would use, you know, much more holistic words like being gentle or not making an effort, or, you know, very natural kind of language that they would use. The Buddha was Indian. He was very Indian. You know, Indians, they very, you know, determined. They're very gung-ho about things.
It's putting more effort so that you can be more effortless.
Yeah, yeah. It takes on a life of its own. Yeah. And there may be times when it comes easily, and there may be times when it just won't come at all. That's normal. That's part of our practice. But do recognize it when the mind does come together. This gathering of power, I mentioned this, there's a sutta, the Buddha said, remember, imagine a well, of a spring of water, and the water comes up through the ground and it leaks away in 6 different directions. He said, now what if somebody were to come and build a dam, you know, small dam around that spring? What would happen? The water would come up and would gather inside that wall that you have built. The water leaking away in 6 different directions, he explained in the sutta, is the consciousness getting caught up in cognizing the 6 different kinds of cognition, 6 senses. Damming the consciousness from going out to those 6 kinds of cognition, building that wall, that is the mindfulness grounded in the body. The water coming up in the well is the gathering of power of the consciousness. And he said, then if you were to break the wall of the wall at any point, a big body of water would go rushing off in that direction. He says, in the same way you build up the power of your consciousness, so it becomes immensely powerful and strong. Another description he gave of this was like a team of 4 horses and a carriage. And the 4 horses are well watered, they're well fed, they're restless and they're eager to go. As soon as you jump in that chariot and crack the whip, the horse will be off down the road. He said, when you have this gathering of the energy, the consciousness becomes so strong that he's ready for action, ready to work. Yeah. So I like these kind of definitions, but you rarely hear people talk about it. Usually I hear Dharma teachers talk about, there's one I was listening to, I won't mention their name, but they were talking about Dharma and meditation in light of the Roe versus Wade Supreme Court justice decision in America. I'm like, that's not what the Buddha was talking about. He was a mystic, and he was talking about this deep spiritual, mystical experience that many people have. An intuition is there. Many of us have had experiences of it, towards it, about it. We have an intuition that it's there and where it is. And this drives our practice. Sometimes it's come from even drug experiences or past life experiences, or near-death experiences, or childhood experiences. I remember these experiences very clearly from my childhood, before my parents ruined it. Taught me to go to school and memorize things and do things. And I remembered clearly, I asked my mother, I could enter into this experience. I'd look up into the corner of a room. I now know what it is, but at the time I didn't know what I was doing. And my body would suddenly become very, very large, to the point where I would open my eye and peep out and check whether I'm actually normal size or not. And I asked my mother, what is it when you do this? And she said, I don't know what you're doing, but it's not very good. So, and I distinctly remember that the final time when I did it as a child, and I could just about get this experience, but I had too many thoughts in my mind. And the thought occurred to me, oh, I'm getting older now. I have things to think about. And that was the last time that I had this experience, until like 30 years later, sitting in a monastery in Thailand, and I had the experience again. I'm like, that's it. I remember that. So my own point is, for many years I was doing many Dharma talks, and I do Dharma talks about Buddhism and environment and Buddhism and anger and economics and all kinds of different things. But I realized more and more from my own practice and from reading the sutras, the Buddha was a mystic, and he was pointing to this deep mystical experience that can be understood, that can be trained, that can be touched on. And by the way, you don't need to be a monk. Many people used to come to see my abbot. He passed away now, but from all over the world, who were having these experiences but didn't know how to relate to it or what to do with it. And often they would just be ordinary, regular people. Yeah. So I learned that if you want to make a consistent effort, then becoming a monk is a superb way to do that. But don't count yourself out from being able to make attainments. I've seen many people make these attainments and have these experiences.
Thank you, Bhante Pandit. Thank you so much for your talk tonight.